Descartes' goal in the Meditations on First Philosophy is to establish a new foundation for all of knowledge. His success marks the beginning of modern science. Descartes lived during a very difficult time in Europe. Catholics and Protestants waged multiple, very bloody wars. Descartes was himself a Catholic, though he spent most of his adult life in the Netherlands, where there was more intellectual freedom. Descartes' main concern was not religious, but instead was creating a new foundation for knowledge. This corresponds to the branch of epistemology. Descartes is a rationalist because he thinks human reason is the starting point for human knowledge. Specifically, as we will see in the second meditation, Descartes thinks that reason is more fundamental than sensory experience. Descartes also endorses a foundationalist epistemology because he thinks that knowledge is a recursive system built upon a small set of simple elements. Everything that we know rests upon the operation of human reason in conjunction with innate ideas. In presenting this new epistemology, Descartes' main target was Aristotle's approach to studying nature. Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher, and his general approach to studying nature was the dominant framework for more than 2,000 years. By creating a new foundation of knowledge, Descartes uproots Aristotle's entire framework. One reason that Descartes chose to use the meditation format for his argument is because he wanted to conceal the full extent of his intentions. Much of Aristotelian science was attached to scholasticism, which was the official Catholic Church doctrine. This was due to St. Thomas Aquinas' efforts. The Meditations allowed Descartes to attack scholastic doctrines indirectly. The challenge to scholasticism only becomes clear in the final meditation. The most well-known part of Descartes' book is the first meditation. This is where Descartes imagines a form of skepticism never before seen in Western thought. The first meditation begins with Descartes trying to eliminate all of his false beliefs. This is no easy task. It's impossible to examine every single one of our beliefs because we have too many. But Descartes' strategy is to examine the foundation of our beliefs. Notice, this proposal rests on a specific epistemological claim, namely that all of our many beliefs rest on a much smaller foundation. As with a very tall skyscraper, we might not be able to take apart the building piece by piece, but we can demolish it by taking out its foundation. But what sort of foundation does Descartes have in mind for human knowledge? Our five senses are obviously a major source of beliefs. Many of our beliefs are prompted by seeing something, hearing something, touching, tasting, and smelling. But notice that each of our senses deceive us at least some of the time. And if our senses can deceive us, how do we know that our senses haven't deceived us with regard to any specific belief that came from them? Descartes admits, however, that there seem to be quite a few sensations that are obviously true. We all know that a brick wall is hard and will hurt if we bang our heads against it. It seems silly to doubt these sorts of sensory beliefs. Descartes looks for other sources of doubt. Consider an insane person, that is, someone who has major hallucinations. A man might claim that he's the king of France, but he's actually naked and being restrained to a bed in a hospital. So it's possible that seemingly obvious beliefs, like being dressed in clothes rather than being naked, might be completely mistaken. But, Descartes notes, it seems like a bad idea to base my beliefs off of an insane person. So he turns to a third source of doubt, the experience of dreaming. We've all had dreams that we thought were real at the time. After all, nightmares wouldn't be terrifying if we didn't believe they were real while experiencing them. But even when we consider the possibility that we are dreaming, there still seems to be some beliefs that remain true. For example, the images we see in a dream probably come from some external source. I wouldn't have dreamt of a brick wall, a car, or an airplane if I hadn't seen one in real life. Furthermore, the simplest elements of experience, like colors, are the same in dreams as in real life. For Descartes, the idea of God also appears to come from an outside source. He has always believed in God, regardless of whether he was dreaming or awake. But with his last idea, Descartes acknowledges that there are many atheists. These people don't seem to share his belief in an all-powerful being. Thus, there must be some room for doubting God. The difference in viewpoint between Descartes and atheists indicates a major obstacle in Descartes' goal of getting rid of all of his false beliefs. Even after he recognizes that some of his beliefs might be false, he notices that some of these beliefs keep coming back. he can't help but think there really is a God, even if he knows there are other people who disagree. Descartes' solution is to take his idea of a God and flip it on its head. Rather than an all-loving God, Descartes imagines that the universe is created by an evil deceiver. This is a new style of skepticism that had never been seen before in philosophy. In contemporary culture, the best illustration of this kind of massive deception is in The Matrix. In this science fiction movie, humans have been placed in vats by machines who want to harvest their energy. But these humans are being fed electrical stimuli directly to their brains, tricking their brains into thinking they're living normal human lives. The picture on the right is from the moment in the movie where Keanu Reeves is freed from his vat and sees the true reality of his situation for the first time. Back to Descartes, the idea of the evil demon seems to throw doubt on all of his beliefs. He certainly can't trust any of his senses. To be clear, Descartes doesn't think that an evil demon actually exists, but he's using this idea to temporarily suspend his belief in anything that could potentially be false, such as belief in a God and beliefs that come from his senses. Having dropped his skeptical bombshell, Descartes, in the second meditation, looks to see whether he has any remaining beliefs that he knows must be true. The possibility of an all-powerful deceiver appears to cast doubt on every belief. Descartes considers whether an evil demon could even trick him about his own personal existence. Descartes, however, notices that this doesn't work. When he attempts to doubt his own existence, he thereby proves it. This line of reasoning works from a first-personal perspective. I must exist in order to be deceived. In more general terms, if I'm thinking at this very moment, then I must exist at this very moment. Notice that this doesn't prove that other people exist. It only proves the person who is actively doubting his or her own existence must exist. Furthermore, Descartes hasn't yet proven that his sensory perceptions of the world are true, including whether he even has a physical body. All that Descartes knows with certainty at this point is that he exists as a thinking thing. The next task is to better understand this thinking thing. As a thinking thing, we know that all of our mental experiences must exist. This is true even if we don't know whether these mental experiences correspond to anything physical. In other words, if I feel heat, then I definitely have the experience of feeling heat, even if I'm mistaken about there being a fire or some other heat source in front of me. At this point, Descartes acknowledges that this seems to go against people's everyday experience. In our daily lives, it appears that what we are most familiar with are physical things. But Descartes thinks this intuition is wrong. This is the point in the Meditations where Descartes defends a rationalist epistemology. Descartes thinks that reason is more fundamental to knowledge than sensory experience. To show why, Descartes presents the wax example. The idea is this: wax can present contradictory sensory qualities. It can be a hard solid or a viscous liquid. Hard wax is fragrant, cold, and makes a loud noise if I bang it against the table. When soft, wax loses its smell, is hot, and is a liquid that's difficult to hold. Of course, both sets of qualities are wax. Descartes' point is that this would not be obvious if we primarily relied on our sensory experience. The hard wax and soft wax have completely different sensory qualities, and so if our judgment was based on sensations, then we presumably should claim they are two different things. Descartes' solution: we make an intellectual judgment when perceiving the wax. In other words, reason makes sense of the conflicting sensations and guides our perception accordingly. It's important to note this kind of reasoning is largely invisible to our conscious minds. But reason, Descartes claims, is the ultimate basis of perceptions, not passive sensory stimuli. Now that we know we are a thinking thing, Descartes is ready to prove the existence of God. This is necessary before Descartes can have knowledge about anything else. Descartes needs to address the evil demon hypothesis that he raised in the first meditation. If he cannot disprove the existence of an evil demon, then Descartes cannot have any knowledge outside of his own mental experiences. Thus, in the third meditation, Descartes offers his first proof of God's existence. The argument in Meditation 3 is a version of the cosmological argument, with some similarities to St. Thomas Aquinas' arguments. Later, in Meditation 5, Descartes offers his version of an ontological argument. Hence, Descartes is also partly inspired by Anselm's argument for God's existence. In the next 2 slides, I'll briefly summarize Descartes' cosmological argument, since this opens the door for Descartes' discussion of physical reality. In general, cosmological arguments attempt to prove God's existence by showing the need for a first cause or origin of the universe. Descartes' distinctive version of the cosmological argument focuses on the origin of the idea of God. The strategy in Meditation 3 is to show that the idea of a perfect being must originate from an actual perfect being. The first step of Descartes' argument looks similar to Aquinas' 4th proof for God's existence, namely, God is the maximum of qualities like goodness. Descartes claims that a being can never create something more perfect than itself. An imperfect creature cannot create a perfect creature. The second step of Descartes' cosmological argument shifts the focus to where Descartes' idea of a perfect being could have come from. Descartes has an idea of a being that is infinitely large and infinitely powerful. Yet Descartes has never seen a being infinitely large or powerful. Since the human mind is finite and all that it experiences is finite, Descartes concludes that the human mind could not have created this idea of infinity. This step of Descartes' argument is most similar to Aquinas' first 3 proofs for God's existence. The basic reasoning is that something cannot come from nothing. In this case, the specific claim is that infinity cannot come from the finite. For something to count as knowledge, Descartes thinks it must be absolutely certain. The proof of his own existence in Meditation 2 is an example of an absolute certainty. This absolute certainty stems from Descartes having a clear and distinct idea of his own existence. Descartes describes his idea of God as a perfect being as also being clear and distinct. He can derive a number of conclusions from the idea. The being is all-loving, all-powerful, and all-knowing. In this way, Descartes thinks his idea of God is similar to his ideas of geometric figures, like squares and triangles, about which he has many stable ideas. Descartes needs to claim his idea of God is clear and distinct in order to show that it is not a silly or flawed idea that he came up with. But maybe Descartes is smarter than he realizes. In response to this objection, Descartes thinks that potentiality is an imperfection. A perfect being would not need to pursue knowledge because the being would already have all knowledge. But maybe Descartes and all his ideas originate in imperfect causes. This second objection will connect Descartes to his parents. Specifically with regard to the idea of God, the objection would hold that Descartes' parents gave him the idea. In response to this objection, Descartes returns to the basic idea that infinity cannot come from the finite. In this case, where did his parents get the idea of a perfect being? If you trace it back to their parents, this would only push the problem back a generation, and so on. The idea of the perfect being must have been created at some point, and given the first 2 steps, the idea would have to come from a being that possesses that level of perfection. Descartes thus concludes that the idea of God must be innate. In other words, it must be placed in humans from birth, and it must come directly from God. If God is a perfect being, all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful, then why would God allow human suffering? This is the problem of evil that is a central issue in most religions. Descartes thinks about this issue from an epistemic point of view. If God is perfect, why would God allow humans to form false beliefs about the world? This is one of the basic questions that Descartes addresses in Meditation 4. If God is perfect, why would imperfections exist in the world? This includes human errors. Why would God allow humans to make mistakes? Deception indicates weakness and thus imperfection, so God cannot be a deceiver. Descartes thinks human error must thus have a different source. There's nothing wrong with our mental abilities, even if they are limited. Descartes focuses on 2 intellectual abilities, the human will and the human understanding. The understanding in this context means the ability to form beliefs. Meanwhile, the human will means the ability to affirm or deny a belief. Descartes cannot imagine anything being subtracted or added to the will. It is complete. For example, if we took away the ability to reject beliefs, then the ability to endorse beliefs would become meaningless. Descartes thinks this ultimately explains why humans err. Our will, given its unlimited ability to affirm or deny anything, has a tendency to go farther than our intellectual abilities can go. In other words, we can affirm beliefs even when our perceptual or reasoning abilities are too limited to accurately judge the matter. The problem is not with an individual intellectual ability, but instead with how two abilities, the will and the understanding, relate to each other. This is important to Descartes because it shows that error is an individual human's fault. If we follow a proper method, what we would call scientific method today, then Descartes thinks it's possible for humans to avoid error. Having established the source of human error, Descartes is prepared to complete his new foundation of knowledge. In the final two meditations, Descartes shows how he thinks people should study nature. Descartes begins by examining the simplest elements of all our thoughts. This relates back to the discussion of dreams in Meditation 1. With regard to any external object, we can break the object down into its shape, quantity, how it moves, and so on. The evidence that something is an innate idea is that we have a clear and distinct idea of it. In other words, the idea is more stable and precise than would be possible if it were based in sensory experience. Geometric figures provide a good example. There are no perfect triangles in nature, even if you can draw a triangle that very closely approximates the ideal form. Triangles, like other geometric figures, can't simply be fanciful ideas since they possess objective truths. In the case of triangles, they have three sides, the sum of their internal angles is 180 degrees, and so on. Even more telling for Descartes is the existence of geometric figures that are impossible to visualize with the human mind. Yet we can still meaningfully discuss and study them. A chiliagon, for example, is a 1,000-sided polygon. It is impossible to visualize this shape in your mind's eye, but we can still calculate the sum of its internal angles with certainty. The sum of the interior angles of a 1,000-sided polygon is 179,640 degrees. At this point, we are prepared to address the material world. Our sensory perceptions strongly incline us to believe in the ideas of physical things. Since God is not a deceiver, as argued in Meditation 3, these sensations must correspond to physical things. Thus, the material world does in fact exist. But there is still an important difference between sensory experience and reality. Many sensory experiences are misleading. This is where you see Descartes most directly rejecting Aristotelian science. Descartes does not think of qualities as essences, as did Aquinas and every other Aristotelian thinker. Think back to Aquinas' fourth proof for the existence of God. All qualities are based in some pure maximum form. For the quality of heat, the maximum is fire. For goodness, the maximum is God. When it comes to our perception of the external world, Descartes believes this is all completely false. The qualities that we feel in sensory experience do not correspond to the essence of the physical objects. Consider heat again. We have shown that heat really exists, but we don't directly perceive the essence of heat. The purpose of perceiving the physical world, Descartes argues, is not to give us access to the essence of material objects, but instead to simply direct our physical bodies away from pain and towards pleasure. In order to have knowledge, as we saw in the wax example, we have to clarify sensory experience with reasoned intellectual judgments. In other words, we have to do science. With this shift, Descartes completely transforms the study of nature. Rather than categorizing essential qualities like heat, colors, goodness, and so on, the task is now to apply the simple universal ideas that we discussed earlier. Of special importance is mathematics. With Descartes, we see the modern notion of kinetic motion. Motion is simply a physical body being pushed or pulled through three-dimensional space, as opposed to Aristotle's idea of an object returning to its natural resting place. Likewise, heat is no longer the essence of fire. Heat is understood as an increase in the motion of invisible particles. Our eyes cannot see these little particles, but that's okay, since that's not the purpose of humans' perceptual capabilities. When studying any natural process, the task is now to try to quantify the process. Descartes thus dramatically increases the connection between mathematics and the natural sciences. This strengthened connection marks in many ways the birth of modern science.